if I were the enemy, if I were Satan, how would I sabotage your recovery? What are the things that I would do to get you off course, knowing that the path that you're on is leading to life? How could I get you back on a path toward death and destruction, division, dissension, all those things, that the negative things that we are trying to get away from in this recovery journey? How would the enemy try to sabotage your recovery, specifically through relationships? Today, we're going to talk about it.
Recovery can be hard, but it's worth it. There is hope knowing we can find healing one step at a time with Jesus and healthy community. Whether you're struggling with a hurt or a hang-up or a habit, you're not alone. During this podcast, we share real stories, practical tools, and powerful truths that inspire you to keep moving forward. No matter where you are on your journey, there's hope ahead. So stick with us as we walk this path together through Celebrate Recovery.
Welcome, everybody. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I struggle with drugs, alcohol, and perfectionism. My name is Rodney. I'm the ministry leader and pastor of Celebrate Recovery here at Fellowship Rogers, and it's good to be back with you. So excited about today. We're going to be launching into a new series of podcasts leaning into that hard question that if the enemy wanted to sabotage my recovery, what would he do? What would be some of the behaviors, the actions that he might do in my life? And excited to have a brother in Christ with me, Andy Petrie. Andy, introduce yourself and we'll jump into a conversation.
Yeah. Hey, man. I am a grateful believer in Jesus. I struggle with anxiety, depression, sexual addiction, and grief. And my name is Andy.
Hey, Andy. So jumping into this conversation, man, this is a fun topic, a little bit scary topic, if I'm being honest, because there's a part of it just kind of checks in my heart like, ooh, this is scary that these are things that I need to be paying attention to in my recovery. But what's the first thing that hits you when you think about, if I were the enemy and I wanted to sabotage your recovery through relationships? General thoughts on that, and then we'll get into some more specifics.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I think, as you and I have talked about it, like it feels like the enemy does love to work in just kind of sowing disunity within our relationships, whether it's through shaking our confidence in what we feel like or should be secure relationships. I know in my life I've seen how resentment can kill my recovery, and even just on my own, the way that I can get in my own head about things and think that I'm trying to be a mind reader towards others because I'm too afraid to voice what is actually going on, or perhaps I'm too afraid to step in to conflict. I feel like this topic of relationships, if I'm not careful in my recovery, is really fertile soil for the enemy to kind of get in there and just do his thing.
Yeah. Well, and specifically through relationships. I mean, relationships are a pretty core component of the Christian walk, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I hear you say all the time, and I fully agree with it and love this idea that God created you and I for connection, connection with him, connection with others, connection with ourselves, making sure that we're aware of our own heart and mind. And that is one of the things that, you even look in the New Testament, so many of the times whenever you read the word you in our English translations, it's actually second person plural in the original language. So it's y'alls in there.
Yeah. So with that, let's jump in there. You know, one of those things that we were kind of discussing is, if he wanted to sabotage my recovery through relationships, he might kind of create this sowing division and conflict. And what do I mean by that? Kind of that thriving on discord in our relationship, causing arguments or misunderstandings, even resentments between us in our relationships. And that can be a big part of derailing the recovery process. So talk about that sowing division and conflict as a way of sabotaging our recovery.
Man, the word that really stuck out to me that you just said was just creating misunderstandings in conflict. And I know for me, one of the things that I think can be used so easily in that spot is me assuming intent based off of somebody's impact of what they've said. Oh, you're doing this particular thing, rather than me staying curious and going, hey, this landed kind of weird for me.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand. I just can go, man, I'm such a good storyteller in my own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in that space, and I think it's a way for me to kind of pull into a low level of isolation of there's a conflict between me and you.
Mm-hmm.
Something that came my way felt weird.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to assume that I know why it came that way.
Yeah.
Rather than me having the courage to go, hey, man, we've got a lot of relationship. I love you. You love me. What just happened there?
Yeah.
Help me understand.
Yeah. What just happened, and being honest about how it hit me in that, right? So, and I think that's good, kind of thinking about the form versus function, how I interact in my relationships. Am I attacking you in revealing how I feel attacked, right?
Yeah.
You always do that. You never do this, right? So the always and the nevers in those conversations is, hey, what just happened there? That kind of hit me weird and kind of made me feel like there's something there. There's something between us that needs to be resolved right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think about the function of shame in that particular space. For me, I always tell folks that I didn't know how to have relationships before I got into recovery because I was so focused on my own self-preservation, and I've got to look good. I've got to look competent. And so when I'm living with those lies, and even though God has healed a lot in those lies in my life, those are the very places that I feel like the enemy knows that there's a gap in my armor. And so, man, something came my way that feels like it's hitting on that spot where maybe there's been a lot of healing, but there's also been a lot of messages of me being not enough or me being defective somehow. And so my shame, before I even realize it, hits me in that spot. Oh, you said something that I fear about myself. And I can, before I realize it, I'm functionally believing this lie that the enemy just loves to latch on to. And not even realizing that, man, my own head is starting to spin a narrative that the feeling and the emotion is real.
Yeah.
But it causes me to isolate and self-preserve.
Yeah. I've said this before, but if the enemy can't get to me and try to derail me, he'll try to get to me through my relationships. And James 4:1-2 is good. There's a couple passages here. What James 4:1-2 says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Do they come from your desires that battle within you?" In Ephesians 4:26, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." It's interesting, in your anger, sometimes we can buy into this notion that anger's bad, but in my anger, it's making sure that I'm not using it as a weapon toward my relationships. And if I feel like it's being used as a weapon, I want to slow that down to understand what the anger is trying to say. But it's just good to be reminded that we're going to have times when we are angry with each other, but don't use it as a weapon. So what's some ways to combat that?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you keep from, you kind of talked about slowing it down. Hey, what just happened in your experience in relationships, knowing they're so important so that you don't sow division and kind of conflict in that space? How do you combat that?
Yeah. I think the first thing, and we already kind of talked about it a little bit, but is just noticing it.
Yeah.
It's funny. As soon as there's conflict in relationships around me, I feel it in my body before my mind is really cognizant of it.
Yeah.
I feel my blood pressure rise. I feel my chest tighten up. I feel myself kind of getting amped up. It's
Yeah.
kind of that almost like that fight or flight
Yeah.
kind of response in there.
Stay curious.
And so being able to be kind enough to myself to go, whew, something's going on with me. And that just means that something happened here.
Yeah.
So what's happening here? And then in that space, allowing myself to be honest with my fears. And so there's a level of, I've got to be vulnerable with myself in that moment.
Yeah.
And not shame the fact that I feel like something fired up in me.
Yeah.
But also, I've got to lean into what I know to be the truth about this relationship. And that is one of the hardest things for me sometimes, because I want to validate my own pain in there, but also leaning into, all right, I know my wife just said this, but man, my wife loves me more than anybody else in the world. And so what is the foundation of our relationship in here? This friend of mine, I've known this friend for forever. This is out of character. I know the character. And so it's kind of in my head, kind of in the moment, allowing myself to go, all right, wait a second, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to be mindful that, I want to resolve this quickly so it doesn't become something bigger later. It's like, oh, forget it. I'll kind of minimize it. But I want to stay curious with that. And I think, too, how do I take responsibility for my part of the receiving end of that? Because, and it's a good reminder, just because you've been triggered by something doesn't mean you're right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So the curious posture is, hey, this hit me wrong. It could be misreading the body language, overtly, covertly stated through words, but covertly through my actions, my mannerisms. It may be misattuned there, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think in that too, one of the things because I struggle with anxiety that can come up in conflicts in relationship. And for me, just knowing that my anxiety, my emotion is real, but my anxiety may be a response to a real or a perceived danger that I have. And that oftentimes for me, those perceived dangers come back to those things, those insecurities, those fears that I have towards myself that may not be grounded in how other people are actually thinking about me.
Yeah. So another thought that can sabotage is isolation and withdrawal.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
This is that place of, he may encourage us to kind of into this place of you're better to be alone right now, create discouragement. Those people don't really care about me. And I hear that sometimes when people might not show up for a general meeting, that what's the point? Those people don't care about me. So how is isolation and kind of withdrawing from your community play into the sabotaging?
Oh, man. Well, what's going into my mind right now is some old National Geographic documentaries where you look at wolves that are attacking caribou up in Alaska. And like one of the things that wolves try to do is they try to target the weak ones and separate them from the herd. Because when they're separated from the herd, it's not a lot of work to take them down. And I think about in James chapter 5 where it says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. It's just one of many places where we see that healing happens in the context of community as we bring God and others into that space. And so if I am disconnecting myself from others, it's hard for me to we need other people's voices to point us towards truth. A friend of mine says a lot that God speaks to us through God's word, God's spirit, but also God's people. And I know there's been so many times where I've had other people speaking to me that have encouraged me. And so when I separate myself from that, I'm separating myself from one of the lifelines that God has given me in my recovery to actually stay stable.
So sometimes we can know that, and so let's lean into that. I know all the things you just said.
Yeah.
But what do I do even though I know it, and yet I'm hearing this voice that says, you're better off, right? So you have these kind of conflicting. What do you do with that? How do I, in the moment, when I'm hearing those lies, what do I do with that?
Yeah. I think for me, leaning into that, and I'm trying to get myself into those spaces.
Because it's a real thing.
It's a real
we hear
thing.
that a lot.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And you may be even listening to this right now, and you're feeling that in there. And I think one, just validating that the feeling is real that you're feeling.
Yeah.
It's like there may be really good reasons why it's really hard for you to trust people,
Mm-hmm.
or there may be some things that you're wrestling with that you're feeling some shame over,
Mm-hmm.
and allowing yourself to feel that. But also remind yourself, could you stay curious to the possibility of the things when you leaned into somebody else and it did go well?
Right. Well, yeah, and I think even in that reaching out to somebody to even state that what you're believing, it's like, hey, this is what I'm believing, that I'm better off alone, that people don't really love me, and I just want to be honest about that, instead of just kind of trying to manufacture up this white knuckling, I'm just going to go do this, and I'm just going to, under my own power, my own willpower, kind of push through that. Now, sometimes there's value in that, but sustaining that is probably not good. It's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
I got to invite you in. It's like, hey, can I just invite you into lies that I'm believing?
Yeah.
That I have this tendency to withdraw. And what's ironic is sometimes, and I've even experienced this in my life, where when I start to get close to someone, part of the sabotage is this is going to fail. So let me get ahead of it. So there's a sense of control in that. It's like, at least you can't say I failed if I make the first move. I'm going to sabotage the relationship and disconnect from you, stop reaching out to you, stop meeting with you, drop out of my group, because I want to be in control of the failure.
Yeah.
Which sounds so bizarre to say it that way.
I know, man, but it sounds like you're reading out of my journal. I can think at times too, like in my recovery, that idea of reaching out. There's so many times where I'll either text or call my sponsor and just go, man, I just got to tell you, I'm in a bad headspace. I feel like I'm an idiot. I feel like I'm blowing it. And I feel like nobody wants to be around me right now. I think I know what voice is speaking that, but man, can you just speak into this?
Yeah. Well, and I think even as you're thinking proactively, even early in the recovery process, so we're talking about in the moment.
Yeah.
What if you invite your sponsor, your accountability team into your action tendencies way in advance, saying, hey, I trust you, and I'm going to let you into this, that here's when things start going well, here's my tendency. Yeah. This is what I tend to do, and this is what you'll see in me. I'll stop calling you. I'll stop showing up at meetings. If you see whatever the action is for you, if you see that, I want to give you permission to speak into that, because that's where I'm in dangerous territory. That's where the enemy is working in me, and I'm actually trying to, even in a weird way, as crazy as that sounds, trying to sabotage the very thing that's bringing me life. And so I give you permission to call me out on that.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting too is kind of the other side of it. We've talked about how shame can drive isolation, but there's also a sense of pride that can drive isolation too. Control. Hey, I've been, things are going well and I've been doing this. I actually don't need people anymore. And we can slip back and do that same lie that got us into that hole in the first place. Yeah.
When we read this verse a lot in recovery, Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 10, two are better than one. If one falls down, we're better when we have someone there to pick us up. And so staying connected, and we say this often, that when you're tempted to isolate, be proactive, but in the reactive, get your rear end there, your heart will follow. Yep. I've never heard anybody say, man, I wasted my time tonight. I shouldn't have come to this meeting tonight. I've never heard that. It's always like, man, I don't know. I'm tired. Maybe it's just better I just hang out. They're not going to miss me tonight, right? That kind of thing. So making sure we're staying connected with people. I want to take a super quick break right here, Andy, and when we come back, I want to jump into maybe the idea of through our relationships, how does returning to old habits play into that sabotaging? So stick with me. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Hey, Forever family. Being in a community of fellow strugglers who are committed to working their recoveries is essential to our success in having victory over our hurts, hang-ups, and habits. Every Friday night, we have a Celebrate Recovery meeting at Fellowship Fayetteville and Fellowship Rogers. At 6 p.m., we have a great meal for connection with other recovery brothers and sisters. Then we meet for large group at 7 p.m., followed by an open share group at 8. Same schedule on both campuses. Different teachers, different worship teams, but the same great experience. We'd love for you to join us this Friday night. It's never too late to start or start over again. For more information, go to fellowshipcr.org.
Welcome back. So great conversation here, Andy. I want to jump into another point that I think is key is in community, we're stronger. If I can if the enemy could sabotage me by pulling me away from my network, it could pull me back into some old patterns of sin, addiction, kind of undermining my recovery efforts. So how does returning to my old habits play into the relationship circle in your mind, man?
Yeah, that's good. I think about, what's kind of coming up for me is I think about In Life's Healing Choices, that great book that's part of our Celebrate Recovery material.
Yeah.
It talks about in relapse, the 4 C's of relapse: complacency, confusion, compromise, and catastrophe. And I think about, especially in that complacency and confusion place, that complacency is that, okay, now I feel like I'm in a better spot, and so I'm going to kind of throttle back. Maybe I don't need to go to a meeting this week, or you know what, I'm actually doing well. We start to functionally believe that the power that helped us recover is not the power that keeps us recovered. And then the confusion place is this spot where we go, I don't think it was that bad when I was in that spot. I kind of want, and we start kind of fantasizing about the glory days in there. And what's interesting is, like, temptation still comes no matter how long we've been in this recovery process. And I've got to be honest with myself. So my main area of recovery is sexual addiction. And I still keep that in my introduction because that's a part of my story. And even though God has done so much work of healing in that, I do know that that's probably an area that the enemy will lean into whenever I'm stressed, whenever there's season changes, whenever there's life pressure that's going on. And I've got to be honest that habit was a place where I found comfort when I couldn't find comfort from others.
Yeah.
Growing up in my life. And so when there's really heavy seasons of change, I've got a new kid and my schedule's totally crazy now. There's sicknesses in my family, and so there's grief that's happening there. Or there's just a lot of stress going on in my life. I've got to be mindful that, hey, the enemy might use those areas that I used to run to for false connection to convince me to, hey, you don't need to go to this safe relationship. You're exhausted. You're tired. You're lonely. Hey, you remember this old thing?
Yeah. Well, and in the context of relationships with that is when we stop getting around our circles of accountability, sponsors, hope, encouragement, then it becomes more tempting to be drawn to this old way of life again.
Yeah.
Right? So as long as I'm in those relationship circles, I have a better shot at staying plugged in, to continuing to focus on God, to continue to stay in His Word, to continue to keep my direction of worship and exaltation to the right source and not to whatever that coping strategy was.
Yeah. And, to that point right there, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that I get to lead and celebrate recovery now, because it allows me, as I'm in open share group on Friday night, as I'm stepping into step studies again and again and again, I continually see people that remind me of what it was like for me in the beginning of my recovery.
Yeah.
And it does two things for me. One, it reminds me of the consequences. But second, it draws me into deeper compassion for others and myself in that. And I just want to say, if you're listening to this right now, and maybe you're in the beginning of your recovery, maybe you're in your struggle and you feel like, man, I can't offer anything to anybody. I just want to tell you, your presence on a Friday night in that open share group is so valuable.
We need each other.
We need each other.
Yeah.
And so, like, when I get away from my relationships and I'm not hearing guys continue to move forward in their recovery,
Yeah.
it kind of, I start to lose steam and get off track in mine.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think, and I've used this analogy before, but I love the picture of this when that movie Castaway.
Yeah.
Right. So Tom Hanks is on an island for 4 years. He's been alone, basically losing his mind. Very, very hard season, just a survival. And oftentimes the comparison is we've lived on this island of isolation ourselves, right? We call that misery island. So he's trying to get off this island. He finally gets off the island, but through the course of the 4 years, he's developed this relationship with a ball, a volleyball, right?
Yep.
Wilson. And it's a silly story, right? I mean, it's like, how does that relate to recovery? But in the context of finding the volleyball, it was a FedEx plane, so he found this volleyball. He cut his hand, and it made this face. So he put eyes in it, and the irony is this became his source of connection. He's like, well, that's silly. He's like, I would never connect to a volleyball. Well, now hang on a second. What are some of the bizarre things that we've connected with in our life? The pipe, the drug, the internet site, the unhealthy relationships, the substance, all those things, performance, people pleasing, all those things. We attach ourselves to something, and that's what Tom Hanks does in this movie, right? So he gets on this raft. He finally gets off the island. The volleyball falls off of the raft while he's asleep. He wakes up. He can't find Wilson, and it's really an intense scene. I didn't cry. But no, it moved me. I was like, why am I moved by this? Because we all have this innate longing inside of us to connect with someone, something.
Yeah.
So he gets in the water. He starts swimming toward this volleyball, crying out to Wilson, but he's got the rope to the raft, and he's trying to figure out. Okay, he comes to this crossroads. Do I leave my raft that feels like will keep me alive, or do I move toward my longings, which is risky? That means to move toward my longings, I've got to leave my protections. And a lot of times those coping strategies in isolation, in disconnection, withdrawing, in our addictions, whatever it is, feel safe to us. It's our way of protecting ourselves. But what that picture shows me is we all have this longing inside of us. And if we don't fulfill it with the right source, vertically first, and this way, right, with each other, relationally, brother to brother, sister to sister, with our community and Celebrate Recovery, we will find ways to stay in this place of protection that feels like it's satisfying the longing in our heart. Yeah. But it never works, right? So we return to old habits. We start connecting with a volleyball. As bizarre as that sounds, whatever your volleyball is becomes your connection. That this is such a good picture for me of how we have this wiring inside of our brain, inside our body that says, I have a longing inside myself. And that's why a relationship with Jesus is so critical.
Yeah.
If we don't connect with him, we're going to keep searching for something and longing to fulfill through other things that never satisfy.
Yep.
But relationship with others is just as critical. Love God, love others. Very critical. What's coming up for you right now?
I remember a long time ago, early in my recovery, I heard that my attempts to find fulfillment through my addictions or my compulsive behaviors, my defenses, is a way that my heart is trying to fulfill eternal longings with temporary things, and which is why they never satisfy.
Yeah.
But as you're talking about this, what are the things that are eternal?
Mm-hmm.
God is eternal, and our souls are eternal. And so, Rodney, because you and I are believers in Jesus, we're in this for the long haul. We're in this for eternity,
right?
And our relationship is eternal as well.
Yeah.
And so, first and foremost, my relationship with Jesus is never going away. But my relationship with my brothers is never going away either.
Yeah.
And that's the only real eternal thing that we've got.
Yeah. So a passage jotted down here, Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Relationships are key in keeping us from again being a slave to this yoke of slavery, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, so what would you say, this will be part one on this topic, but what would you say to someone that maybe some of those things that we've covered, that sowing division and conflict, encouraging isolation, withdrawal, maybe tempting to return to old habits because we're disconnecting from the body. What would you say to someone that maybe is wrestling with some of those things to bring some encouragement?
Yeah, I think one is lean in to the reality of how Jesus sees you and his heart towards you. There is so much shame that I've carried over the course of my life. And so much of that shame was the leverage that the enemy used to keep me from relationships. And I think of Hebrews 7:25, where it talks about Jesus. He always lives to make to intercede for us. He's always talking to the Father about you and I.
Yeah.
And it says he is able to save to the uttermost. And what's cool is that word "to the uttermost," when it was originally written, it means completely, comprehensive wholeness. And so what it articulates is that deepest, darkest place of shame and brokenness in your heart is the very place that Jesus wants to lean in and love.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I've got to allow myself to be curious to the possibility that maybe that actually is true.
Yeah.
And then in that as well, since I know the voice of Jesus through his word, thinking through what are the voices that I'm hearing whenever I'm in these places that I feel like, man, I can't bring anybody else into this, or nobody else wants to be a part of it. What's the tone of the voice?
Yeah.
That might give me a good clue of who's speaking it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's good. I mean, if the enemy's trying to get in your heart and your head he's trying to break your relationships to get you discouraged through misunderstandings. If he's trying to bring you to a place of isolation, withdrawing, if he's trying to tempt you to go back to some of those old ways, remember, you're no longer bound by those old sins in Christ. But don't forget the value of others being in your life to face the thing that you're facing. He wants to pull you away from the pack, and if he can do that, then he's going to create some destructive paths that will take us back to the old way of living. 2 Corinthians 5:17, anyone who is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone. The new is here. What does that mean? We got to stay connected with him. We got to stay connected with each other. And relationships are pretty key and crucial for us. So, Andy, thanks. Part one of this conversation. Appreciate your heart and your insights in that, and we'll continue that conversation in the next episode. But hopefully that gives you some food for thought. Just if I were the enemy, how would I sabotage your recovery? I would try to sow some dissension, some conflict, some bitterness. I would try to isolate you and pull you away from the community that you live in, and I would try to instill this place of maybe tempting you to go back to your old ways. Don't listen to those lies. Stay connected in your community. Don't try to face this alone. We need each other, and we need God, but we need each other too. And He puts relationships in our life to face this. And so I just want to encourage you, wherever you are, jump into the process. If you're in the process, stay in the process. You're too important, and God loves you too much. He wants that to fellowship with you, and there's so much freedom that we can experience in that new space. Hey, thanks so much for listening today. I pray that you'll join me next time. Until then, God bless you guys.